Your feet are cold. Not always. Not during the summer or after a walk or when you first wake up and the blood is still moving from the night's circulation. But in the evening, under the covers, when the day has been long and the house is cooled and your body is settling towards sleep, you notice that your toes take longer to warm up than they did a decade ago. The warmth that used to arrive within minutes now takes longer. The cold that used to lead your feet first now leaves them last. You have adapted without examining the adaptation. Thicker socks appeared in the drawer. A pair of slippers migrated from the closet to the bedside. The thermostat crept upward in October. At some point, you stopped thinking of your feet as cold and started thinking of them as your feet. This is how they are now. The way reading glasses appeared on the nightstand, and the stairs got steeper, and the morning stiffness lasted longer than it used to. Cold feet joined the catalog of things that changed gradually enough to feel inevitable. The cold is data, as specific and as readable as a blood pressure number or a heart rate, if you know what the temperature is measuring. Something is happening inside the blood vessels of your feet that the skin temperature is reporting. A change in the diameter of the arterioles that deliver blood to your toes. A change in the compliance of the major arteries that feed those arterioles from as far away as the abdomen. A change in the ability of the endothelial cells lining those vessels to produce the single molecule that controls whether the vessel dilates or constricts. The cold is not the problem. The cold is the measurement. A thermal readout of blood flow, and blood flow is determined by vessel diameter, and vessel diameter is determined by endothelial function. And endothelial function declines with age at a rate that becomes. Your feet are the most distal vascular territory in your body. The blood that reaches your toes has traveled the longest arterial path available, descending from the heart through the aorta, branching at the iliac bifurcation, passing through the femoral and popliteal arteries of the leg, and arriving at the pedal arch through arteries that narrow progressively at every branch point. The vascular territory that declines earliest and most severely. The territory where peripheral arterial disease, diabetic microvascular damage, and age-related endothelial dysfunction announce themselves years before any other symptom appears, is the territory reporting through your cold toes every evening. The warmth return speed after a 10-second toe clench maps this territory with a precision the cold alone cannot provide. And the physics of how that mapping works is what the second half reaches after establishing what happens inside the vessels during the clench itself. Curl your toes. All of them as hard as you can. A maximal voluntary contraction that engages the flexor digitorum longus and the flexor hallucis longus, pulling from the deep posterior compartment of the calf, their tendons running beneath the medial malleolus at the ankle and inserting on the undersurface of each toe. These are the extrinsic toe flexors, powerful muscles housed in the calf that pull the toes into flexion through tendons. Simultaneously, the intrinsic toe flexors, the flexor digitorum brevis in the sole, the lumbricals between the metatarsals, the interossei on both sides of each toe, contract within the foot itself, adding a second layer of flexion force from muscles embedded directly in the tissue the test is measuring. Muscles in the arch of the foot, dormant for years in many adults who have worn supportive shoes since childhood, as the barefoot discussion described, fire alongside the toe flexors during a maximal clench, compressing the plantar venous plexus against the sole. This venous plexus is a network of thin-walled veins spread across the bottom of the foot like a sponge, and the muscular compression squeezes blood out of this sponge and drives it proximally through one-way venous valves toward the ankle and calf. The foot has its own venous pump, a smaller version of the calf pump that drives venous return during walking, and the toe clench activates it from a seated position, producing venous clearance in the most neglected vascular territory that receives zero pumping during the hours you spend sitting. Hold for 10 seconds. Not 5, not a brief squeeze. 10 full seconds of sustained maximal contraction, long enough for the metabolic consequences of the occlusion to accumulate in the compressed tissue to the level required for the test to produce a meaningful vascular response. What happens during those 10 seconds is capillary occlusion, the same fundamental mechanism the wall sit produces in the quadriceps, applied here to the smallest and most distal muscle groups in the body. The contracting intrinsic foot muscles generate intramuscular pressure that partially or fully collapses the capillaries threaded through the muscle tissue. These capillaries are the narrowest blood vessels in the body, 5 to 10 micrometers in internal diameter, barely wide enough for a single red blood cell to deform and squeeze through in single file. their walls consisting of a single layer of endothelial cells wrapped in a basement membrane so thin that oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse across it in milliseconds. They are exquisitely sensitive to external compression. The muscle fibers surrounding each capillary squeeze inward during contraction like fingers closing around a drinking straw, and the thin capillary walls, one endothelial cell thick with no smooth muscle layer of their own to resist the compression. Blood flow to the contracting tissue decreases towards zero as the capillary lumens close under the mechanical force of the surrounding muscle. The arterial blood arriving from the digital arteries encounters the closed capillary bed and backs up behind the obstruction, creating a hydrostatic pressure gradient that will discharge rapidly the moment the obstruction releases. Well, compressed tissue does not stop working during the occlusion. The muscle cells continue consuming oxygen at their active metabolic rate, burning glucose through aerobic glycolysis, producing carbon dioxide as a waste product, generating adenosine as a byproduct of ATP hydrolysis. But the blood supply that should be replenishing oxygen and clearing these waste products has been physically interrupted by the contraction surrounding the capillaries. Oxygen tension in the local tissue drops measurably within the first few seconds of sustained contraction. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the interstitial fluid surrounding the occluded capillaries as the muscle cells continue aerobic metabolism without the blood flow to remove the waste gas. Lactate accumulates as the oxygen supply runs low, and the cells shift toward anaerobic glycolysis to maintain ATP production. Adenosine, one of the most potent vasodilators the body produces, released during ATP hydrolysis as a direct byproduct of energy consumption, builds up in the extracellular space at concentrations that would produce immediate arterial dilation if the vessels were free to respond. Hydrogen ion concentration rises as carbon dioxide reacts with water through the carbonic anhydrase reaction to produce carbonic acid, lowering the local pH toward the acidic range. Potassium ions leak from them. Each of these molecules acts directly on the smooth muscle cells wrapping the walls of the arterioles, feeding the compressed territory, each one binding to specific receptors on the smooth muscle cell membrane and triggering intracellular signaling cascades that reduce the calcium concentration inside the muscle cell, allowing the contractile proteins to relax and the vessel wall to widen. The signals are redundant by design. Adenosine acts through A2 receptors. Carbon dioxide acts through direct pH effects on smooth muscle. Hydrogen ions act through acid-sensing ion channels, and potassium acts through inward rectifier. Potassium channels. 5 independent vasodilatory pathways converging on a single outcome, ensuring that the tissue's metabolic demand for increased blood flow cannot be ignored once the compression releases. The redundancy is the body's engineering margin. Even if one pathway is impaired by disease or aging, the remaining 4 still drive the arterial dilation that the reactive hyperemia requires. But the vessels cannot respond. The external compression from the clenched muscles maintains the capillary occlusion regardless of the vasodilatory signals accumulating around the vessels. The mechanical force exceeds the chemical signal. 10 seconds of metabolic demand with restricted supply builds what amounts to a vasodilatory charge, a concentrated reservoir of dilating molecules held back by the sustained contraction, ready to discharge simultaneously the moment the compression releases. Release. Let every toe relax completely. The flexors deactivating, the arch muscles releasing, the intramuscular pressure dropping to resting levels within a fraction of a second. The capillaries the arterioles that spent 10 seconds receiving accumulated vasodilatory signals from adenosine, carbon dioxide, lactate, and hydrogen ions dilate simultaneously. Their smooth muscle relaxing in response to the chemical environment, the sustained occlusion created around them. Blood surges into the toe vasculature at several times, the normal resting flow rate, a compensatory flood driven by the pressure gradient between the arterial supply, which maintained its pressure throughout the contraction, and the depleted capillary bed, which spent 10 seconds consuming its oxygen reserves without replenishment. This is reactive hyperemia. The underlying physics is identical in every vascular bed. Temporary occlusion followed by metabolite accumulation, followed by compensatory vasodilation and flow surge upon release. What changes here is the location, and what the location reveals about the cardiovascular system supplying it. The toes sit at the terminal end of the longest arterial pipeline in the human body. The blood that arrives at the digital capillaries after the release has traveled through the aorta, descended through the iliac bifurcation, passed through the femoral artery in the thigh, navigated the popliteal artery behind the knee, descended further through the posterior tibial and dorsalis pedis arteries to the ankle, crossed the pedal arch on the sole, and branched into the digital arteries supplying each individual toe. Every centimeter of that route represents potential resistance, potential stiffening in the conduit arteries, potential narrowing in the muscular arteries, potential endothelial dysfunction in the resistance arterioles, potential basement membrane thickening in the capillaries themselves. The reactive hyperemia response you feel in your toes after the release integrates the functional health of every segment in that arterial chain. Every compromised segment attenuates the surge, every healthy segment transmits it faithfully, and the toes receive the cumulative report. Warmth arrives. You feel it, a flush spreading through tissue that was briefly oxygen deprived. The warmth is infrared radiation from hemoglobin molecules releasing their oxygen payload into recently hypoxic capillary beds, the metabolic heat of cellular respiration restarting in tissue that spent 10 seconds running on anaerobic reserves. The speed at which that warmth arrives, 3 seconds. The first time I tested this, toes clenched under my desk for 10 full seconds, release, waiting. The warmth arrived in my left foot a full 3 seconds before my right. Both feet responded. Both feet warmed. But the asymmetry was unmistakable. The right foot lagging behind, the signal arriving later, the flush weaker and more diffuse compared to the left foot's distinct rapid warming. An asymmetry I had never noticed because I had never measured it, because I had never known that the speed of warmth return was a measurement worth taking. You know what the warmth is? Reactive hyperemia, blood surging through vessels that dilated in response to 10 seconds of metabolic demand. The question changes, because a 3-second return and a 15-second return both indicate reactive hyperemia. Both produce warmth, both confirm that blood reached the toes. But the gap between 3 seconds and 15 seconds maps a vascular landscape the warmth alone does not describe. Fast warmth returned. Warmth spreading through the toes within 3 to 5 seconds of release indicates healthy peripheral vasculature along the entire arterial path from the aortic root to the digital arteries. Compliant arteries that expand under increased flow demand, their elastic walls stretching to accommodate the reactive hyperemia surge without resistance. Arterioles that dilate effectively when adenosine and carbon dioxide signal them to open, the smooth muscle cells in their walls relaxing promptly in response to the accumulated vasodilatory charge. Capillaries that reopen fully the moment the external compression releases, their thin walls expanding to accept the incoming blood without the basement membrane, thickening that would restrict flow even in open capillaries. And endothelial cells that are producing adequate nitric oxide, the molecule that governs arterial diameter throughout the body, the molecule whose production the reactive hyperemia shear stress is specifically testing. The endothelium lines every blood vessel from the aorta to the digital capillaries. A single continuous organ weighing approximately 1 kilogram in an adult spread across a surface area the size of several tennis courts. And the nitric oxide it produces in response to the shear stress of flowing blood is the primary mechanism by which arteries adjust their diameter to match demand. When blood flow increases after the toe clench releases, the flowing blood exerts a tangential drag on the endothelial surface. The endothelial cells detect this shear stress through mechanosensitive proteins in their cell membranes and respond by activating endothelial nitric oxide. The NO diffuses into the surrounding smooth muscle of the arterial wall, relaxing it, widening the vessel, and allowing the surge of warm blood to reach the toe capillaries. A healthy endothelium performs this sequence within seconds. A dysfunctional endothelium, damaged by oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, the glycation products of elevated blood glucose, or the cumulative wear of decades, produces less NO, dilates more slowly, and delivers the blood with a measurable delay that arrives at your toes as slower warmth. Flow-mediated dilation. The artery widening in direct response to increased. The toe warmth return test applies an identical principle to the most distal vascular bed available. The shear stress from the reactive hyperemia surge tests the endothelium's NO capacity, and the speed of the warmth return reflects how effectively every endothelial cell along the arterial path from heart to digit responded. Well, slow warmth return changes the picture entirely. Warmth arriving after 10 to 15 seconds, or arriving as a weak diffuse sensation rather than a distinct flush, indicates compromised peripheral vasculature somewhere along the path from heart to toe, and the location of the compromise is encoded in the pattern of the delivery. The compromised segment could be arterial stiffness in the major conduit arteries, reduced compliance in the iliac or femoral vessels, their walls hardened by decades of collagen cross-linking and elastic fiber degradation, unable to expand rapidly when the reactive hyperemia surge arrives and therefore transmitting it as a dampened, slower wave rather than the sharp pulse a compliant artery delivers. Or it could be endothelial dysfunction, reduced nitric oxide production from damaged or aged endothelial cells, the ENOS enzyme producing less NO per shear. Stress event, the vasodilatory response attenuated at the molecular source. Or arteriolar narrowing, the small resistance vessels in the foot partially occluded by atherosclerotic plaque or chronically constricted by elevated sympathetic tone from the stress and inactivity that characterize modern sedentary life. Or microvascular disease, capillary basement membrane thickening that restricts blood flow even when the capillaries are mechanically open, a hallmark of diabetic microangiopathy that Krakowski and colleagues documented in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology as detectable through post-occlusive reactive hyperemia testing years before clinical symptoms appear. Absent warmth return, no discernible warmth. It suggests severe peripheral arterial insufficiency. Blood flow to the toes is inadequate even under the maximal vasodilatory stimulus that 10 seconds of metabolic demand with complete vascular occlusion can produce. This finding, particularly if consistent across multiple trials on different days and more pronounced in one foot than the other, warrants clinical evaluation for peripheral arterial disease. Diagnostic power in this test is in the location, and in the physics of what distance does to a pressure wave traveling through an arterial system. The toes sit at the terminal end of the longest arterial pipeline in the human body. The reactive hyperemia surge that begins at the pedal arch when the toe flexors release must travel through every segment of that pipeline to reach the digital capillaries, and every compromised segment attenuates the surge, dampens its amplitude, and delays its arrival. A stiff femoral artery does not stop the surge, it slows it, the way a rigid pipe transmits a pressure pulse more slowly than an elastic one. An atherosclerotic tibial artery does not block the surge, it narrows the channel the surge travels through, reducing the peak flow rate. An endothelially dysfunctional arteriole does not prevent vasodilation, it dilates less, producing a smaller increase in local blood flow than a healthy. Each compromised segment subtracts from the speed and completeness of the warmth return. The peripheral reactive hyperemia response measured in the feet correlates with systemic endothelial function measured by brachial artery flow, mediated dilation, the clinical gold standard. The toe warmth return test is not measuring only the toe vasculature. It is measuring the functional capacity of the entire arterial system from the aortic root to the digital arteries, the longest vascular interrogation the body can provide from a single self-administered measurement point. Now, for anyone with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, the feet are where the reason is anatomical. The feet contain the smallest arterioles, the narrowest capillaries, the longest nerve fibers, and the tissue most dependent on adequate microvascular supply to prevent breakdown. Chronic hyperglycemia drives glycation of endothelial proteins, glucose molecules bonding covalently to the structural proteins in the vessel walls, forming advanced glycation end products that stiffen the wall, impair ENOS function by altering the enzyme's molecular environment, and activate inflammatory cascades through the receptor for advanced glycation end products that accelerate atherosclerosis preferentially in the smallest vessels. Autonomic neuropathy damages the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves controlling vascular tone in the feet, reducing the nervous system's ability to modulate blood flow in response to metabolic demand, leaving the vasculature unable to increase delivery when the tissue needs more oxygen. Microvascular insufficiency, capillary basement membrane thickening, parasite loss from the capillary walls, reduced capillary density as damaged vessels fail to regenerate. Precedes visible skin changes by years, as Vives and colleagues demonstrated in diabetes, documenting measurable microvascular dysfunction in diabetic feet that preceded ulceration by. And then, the toe clench release test performed regularly provides a tracking signal in exactly the territory that fails first. warmth return that was brisk at 50 and has become sluggish by 55, particularly with a pre-diabetic metabolic profile, is documenting microvascular decline in the specific vascular bed where diabetic complications begin. The signal arrives years before the ulcer, years before the claudication, years before the claudication, years before the clinical diagnosis. The signal is free. Anyone with diagnosed peripheral arterial disease, diabetic neuropathy with loss of protective sensation, or active foot ulceration should consult their physician before performing sustained isometric contractions of the foot. The metabolic demand may exceed the compromised vasculature's capacity to respond safely. The foot vasculature suffers most during the hours you spend sitting, and for many adults over 55, those hours constitute the majority of the waking day. Gravity pools blood in the lower extremities, increasing hydrostatic pressure in the pedal veins and distending the venous walls beyond their optimal operating diameter. The absence of calf and foot muscle contractions eliminates the venous pump that normally drives blood back toward the heart against gravity, leaving pooled blood stagnant in the pedal vasculature. Blood flow velocity in the pedal arteries and arterioles drops during prolonged sitting, and the shear stress that flowing blood exerts on the endothelial surface drops in direct proportion. This matters because ENOS activation is shear stress dependent. The enzyme requires mechanical stimulation from flowing blood to produce nitric oxide. And when the flow drops, the shear stress drops and the NO production drops with it. Prolonged sitting produces exactly the shear stress deficit and endothelial impairment that Padilla and colleagues published in the American Journal of Physiology, documenting that extended seated immobility degrades the endothelial function that the warmth return test measures. Sitting destroys what the test interrogates. Each toe clench performed during seated work interrupts this cascade. Each 10-second contraction activates the plantar venous pump, compresses stagnant venous blood proximally through the one-way valves, and the release triggers a reactive hyperemia surge that exercises the endothelial surface with elevated shear stress. The specific mechanical stimulus ENOS requires to maintain nitric 5 cycles of clench release, 50 seconds of total contraction interspersed with releases, produces 5 shear stress events in a vascular bed that receives 0 shear stress stimulation during the hours between one walk and the next. The exercise is invisible. Nobody sees the toes flex inside the shoes. Nobody hears the contraction. Nobody notices the brief pause as you hold for 10 seconds. The only external evidence is the faint warmth you feel after each release, the vascular confirmation that the endothelium responded to the shear stress test, that nitric oxide was produced at sufficient quantity to dilate the arterioles, that blood surged through the. Each session is simultaneously diagnostic and therapeutic. The warmth return tells you how the vasculature responded, while the shear stress from the reactive hyperemia surge maintains the endothelial capacity to respond. The measurement exercise is what it tests. The test preserves what it measures. That asymmetry, left foot warming 3 seconds before the right, is why I time the warmth return now. Not every session. The daily practice is about maintenance, about delivering shear stress events to a vascular bed that would otherwise receive none during seated hours. But once a month, seated in an identical chair, at a consistent room temperature, at a consistent time of day, performing an identical. The monthly measurement is crude by clinical standards, imprecise, subjective, uncontrolled for hydration and caffeine and ambient temperature, influenced by the sympathetic tone of the moment. But the trend across months is signal, and the signal is what matters. Stable warmth return across a year. 3 seconds in January, 3 seconds in December. A consistent rapid flush arriving at an unchanged speed in both feet means the arterial tree is maintaining its functional capacity at the current level. The endothelium is producing nitric oxide at a rate sufficient to support full vasodilation when the shear stress test arrives. The conduit arteries from the aorta through the femoral and tibial segments remain compliant enough to transmit the reactive hyperemia surge without dampening its amplitude. The microvascular bed in the toes remains open and responsive enough to accept the incoming blood at the rate the accumulated metabolic demand requires. The pipeline from heart to digit is transmitting the signal faithfully. And then, gradual slowing, 3 seconds becoming 4, becoming 5, across 2 or 3 years, the endothelial function declining at the expected age, related rate, the arterial compliance decreasing as collagen crosslinks accumulate and elastic fibers degrade, the ENOS output gradually diminishing. The rate of decline matters more than the absolute number at any single measurement. A slow progression from 3 seconds to 5 across a decade is normal vascular aging, while a jump from 5 seconds to 12 in 6 months suggests something changed in the arterial path beyond the expected trajectory. Asymmetry that increases, one foot consistently falling further behind the other across several monthly measurements, the gap widening from 1 second to 3 to 5, may indicate localized compromise in the arterial supply to one leg specifically. Unilateral peripheral arterial disease, atherosclerotic narrowing in the iliac, femoral, or popliteal artery on one side, often presents first as an asymmetric warmth return delay before it produces the classic symptom of intermittent claudication. The toes report the narrowing before the calves feel the pain. Under the covers tonight, the toes will be cold again. The cold you have been filing under aging, under genetics, under the way things are now, the way your parents' feet were always cold and their parents before them. The thicker socks address the symptom, and the thermostat compensated for the temperature, but neither read the signal the cold was carrying. The signal was always there, the longest arterial pipeline in the body reporting its functional status through the thermal conductivity of blood, the only medium available to tissue at the farthest point from the heart that has no voice and no pain receptor, sensitive enough to announce the slow narrowing of the vessels supplying it. The cold was never a complaint. It was a measurement waiting for someone to take it. Curl the toes for 10 seconds, then release. The warmth that follows, fast or slow, symmetric or asymmetric, a brisk flush arriving in 3 seconds or a diffuse creep arriving in 15, is the reading. The speed encodes the answer to a question: the cold, 3 seconds to warmth, or 5, or 15. The number is the vascular reading the cold was trying to deliver all along.